All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's AAA HR webinar and annual reviews presented by Scott Moore of Moore EMS Consulting. As many of you guys know, Scott is also the exclusive HR consultant of the American Ambulance Association. Before we go ahead and get started, I just want to remind everyone to please use that Q&A feature on your menu if you have any questions throughout today's presentation. We'll either get to them as we go, we'll address them at the end, or Scott or myself will follow up with you offline after today's presentation. A recording of today's presentation and the PowerPoint slides will also be available on the on-demand section of the AAA's website later this afternoon, and it'll be sent out in tomorrow morning's Daily Digest. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Scott to get us started.
Thank you so much, Meg, and thank you to all of you. I appreciate all of you who are taking the time out of your day to attend. I know that there are a lot of things that call for your time throughout the day in running ambulance services, so I appreciate it. As Meg said, my name is Scott Moore. I am the HR and operations consultant for the AAA, have been for well over 5 years at this point, and also the principal of Moore EMS Consulting, primarily providing HR and employment law related consulting services to ambulance services around the country, as well as some home health agencies. This is our second in the HR webinar series. I know we had nearly 200 people on the last webinar when we were covering the updated employment, the HR handbook for EMS agencies. So thank you for joining us. As Meg said, that this program is going to be recorded and will go out in tomorrow's digest for those who unfortunately didn't get a chance to watch the program live. And of course, if at all you have questions, you can always submit those at info@ambulance.org. As Meg had mentioned, certainly most of us are pretty familiar with the Zoom platform by now. The chat feature, I will be watching the chat feature and in a few instances, we'll be asking you to provide some feedback as we go through the program. But also, certainly, if you have questions, you can plug them into the Q&A feature, and I will either try and answer them as I'm going along, or we'll answer them at the end as we get near questions. And as always, if we are unable to get to your question during the time allotted, I will be sure, I do have the reg list, I'll be sure to grab your name and we'll make sure that we get back to you. So annual performance reviews are sort of the target for today. And I know for many of you who may have seen me speak on this topic before, I've presented on it a whole bunch. I'm not a big fan of annual performance reviews as we put in the topic, right? Quit ignoring your folks 364 days a year. And one of the things that I say to folks are, if you think back to all the annual performance reviews that you ever received, do you really ever recall one that actually drove you to work harder? Maybe one, probably not two, and definitely not three. So why are we even talking about this topic? As we were on the AAA's Workforce Committee call earlier today, and even were kind enough, some representatives from the National Registry joined. What we know is actually there really hasn't been a change whatsoever. If not, there's been an increase in the number of folks going through the National Registry process. And so it's not that there are fewer EMTs and paramedics who are getting certified. In fact, actually the opposite is true. But what we do know is that turnover is a substantial problem. Back from the 2019 AAA Avesta turnover study, we saw that the average turnover in EMS was around 27%, which is about 12% higher than averages for most industries sort of combined. Across most industries, the turnover rate is about 15%, depending upon the industry or the profession. So EMS experiences a turnover rate really almost twice that of what your typical turnover rate is across industries. And the number that's represented on the slide here, the nearly $7,800, I think is a gross underestimation of what turnover is costing EMS organizations. This number really is directly related to those costs of actually just hiring, not the overall financial impact. And we even made a little footnote in that 2019 study. But one of the things that I found concerning, certainly, is in preparing for this, is that just in standard industry, across all industries, they're expecting that voluntary turnover rates are going to increase to roughly 30% by 2023. So if we think about that from the perspective of really nearly doubling the standard turnover rate, my concern is if EMS is already at the 27, nearly 30%, what kind of impact we're going to see from that increase in turnover across industry. So many of you should have received the latest link to the 2021 AAA Newton 360 ambulance industry turnover study. If you haven't seen that, please share that out. Last year, or in the 2019 year, we sent it out to a couple of hundred folks, got roughly about 60 responses. And truthfully, we'd like a larger N number than that. And so what we're asking for folks are, please make sure you complete that survey. If you have all of your information, it shouldn't take you more than about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. We tried to shorten it, but really you can't get because we know people's time is valuable, but you can't get the information that we need. This year, we added some COVID related, some pandemic related questions because we want to try and understand exactly how the pandemic may have impacted EMS and turnover in your organization. Now, one of the things that I'll tell folks is, many of you know I'm tied pretty heavily to the cost collection efforts. Well, this is another one of those areas that, had we had reliable, solid data from across the industry or the profession when we were going to advocate for funds related to the pandemic, we'd certainly be in a better position, or would have been or had more weight to the information that we were bringing to lawmakers when we were trying to advocate for more financial relief. So please, if you haven't already received that email, go to the AAA's website. Certainly you can find it, and share that out to as many groups as you can, because we want to make sure that folks are seeing that and completing that survey. So one of the things that we looked at, and some of this is tied to EMS, and I think EMS is just a microcosm of some of the larger EMS professions, but looking at, what are the primary drivers of turnover in EMS? And some of them are, frankly, that folks hit that wall when they hit the COVID. It was one straw too many. And so they left, either because, like for me, I stopped working actively as an EMT in July of this year because I had my significant other, my wife, also practices medicine, and one of us had to try and stay healthy for our children. Company culture is one of the bigger drivers of turnover, regardless of industry, but in particular in EMS, because we know that nobody who jumps into EMS because they're looking to become a millionaire. This is a job which the value of the work that we're doing is intrinsically valuable. And so it's more about not what kind of ambulance runs you're doing, and less about how big your service is, and more about what your organization internally, what your company culture and your organization stands for. Now, to some degree, EMS, as I used to practice it full time, is a little bit different now. Trucks are working far more harder. People are working harder today than they had been. And in particular, in the face of the pandemic, it has only gotten worse. But some of the other drivers are this perception, either differential treatment or disparate treatment, or the perception of differential treatment. Money and benefits certainly are an issue, but just for most folks, many folks get into this. It's not like the pay got less, right? It's not like when I got into the EMS back in 1990, I took $1 an hour pay cut from a grocery store. I knew what I was getting into, right? The pay and benefits were what they were when I joined EMS. And yes, they haven't improved dramatically, and I wish that they would have. However, pay and benefits are certainly a factor, but not the top factor. Little or no recognition for a lot of folks. Frankly, it's called death by 1,000 cuts, right? They're working their heart out, but they're not necessarily getting the recognition or even at least some acknowledgement of how hard they're working. And then last but not least, certainly a lack of career opportunity. I do hear from a lot of folks that, hey, we're losing people over to public safety, or to another career in medicine, or to some people very rarely actually just completely get out. But what I often hear are, we're just a stepping stone. Well, that really hasn't changed either over the years, although there are more public safety agencies hiring EMTs and paramedics than there were, say, 25 or 30 years ago. However, we as an industry have not done a great job at building career opportunities internally and, in fact, really communicating what the opportunities are within an EMS organization. Most of us who worked our way up into either a senior executive role or a CEO role spotted those lanes on our own, and we made those opportunities on our own, or hopefully had somebody who might have mentored us. But mentoring is not something that we're commonly finding at a lot of EMS organizations. And if you happen to find your way, it's almost accidental, right? As I often hear people say, well, we found a really great EMT or a really great paramedic and we promoted them into a position of leadership. But we all know that oftentimes just because someone happens to be a great paramedic doesn't mean they're going to be a great leader. So we as an entity, almost as we're interviewing people, are like, so why are you really getting into this profession? And when someone says like, I want to help people, we go, no, really, why? And what I say is careful about the message that you're delivering. And so we're going to, and I know in the broader scheme of things, how does this fit into performance feedback? You start providing performance feedback from the moment somebody applies for a job at your organization. In fact, even before, because it is your folks who will be driving the recruitment efforts at your organization. And in fact, your folks who often are responsible for those people who stay. So why do people stay? I often joke, say, don't do exit interviews. You should do stay interviews, right? Find out why people are staying, right? Because oftentimes I hear from employees who stay, geez, they're always asking those who leave why they leave. Why do they not care what I think about why I stay? So for some, the job, it just pure and simply is job satisfaction. They enjoy or get a lot out of helping people. The schedule of the working hours, being able to work a full-time job in a very few number of days for a lot. Sometimes it's the schedule's the thing that hooks them. In organizations, and I was on the phone earlier with someone from Royal Ambulance today, Eve Grau, and I'll tell you, company culture, you could not have an organization with a better, or where the company culture speaks louder than just about anything else than you do at Royal. So what I will tell you is company culture will ultimately be the reason why somebody stays or why somebody goes. One of the factors that we often don't talk about or provide a lot of awareness about is the relationship with your coworkers. A lot of times, the things that kept me working in EMS were the relationships that I had with my partners and the individuals with whom I work. Now, one of the things that we do know, and we'll talk about in a minute, is the frontline supervisor position is probably the single most important position in the entire company, above the CEO, above your CFO, above any other executive. That frontline supervisor is the number one most impactful thing about whether someone stays or goes. Lastly, inertia. Believe it or not, this is one of the top 5 reasons people stay. Why? Because it's just easier to stay than it is to go and go somewhere else. So I am going to ask a quick chat. I'm going to ask for folks to plug into the chat. Do you currently, if you're on the webinar today, do you currently use or are you currently receiving an annual performance review? And I'll keep my eye on the chat. What I'll tell you that, though, is as we go along, is that, oh, no, good. So what we're seeing is a major change from the annual performance review. If you look back here from a study that WorkHuman did in 2016, my apologies, nearly 82% of organizations across all professions or all industries were utilizing an annual performance review process. And as you can see, those numbers are starting to drop. Actually, we're required by contract, but you're now looking to a 360. We'll talk about 360s in a second, but it's great. So started 2 years ago. I'm not suggesting that annual performance reviews don't have value. What I'll say is, if that's your primary mechanism for providing feedback, I think you're leaving a lot of opportunity. And I think you'll realize that, frankly, the efficacy of annual performance reviews is really bad, right? Roughly 8% of companies believe that their annual performance management process is highly effective at driving value, right? 58% of HR leaders believe that annual performance reviews are a waste of time. I used to work as an HR director for a very large service here in the north of Boston. And every month I would walk into a room with 25 or so supervisors and a stack of 80 annual performance reviews. And I would say, who sees Joe? Someone would say, I see Joe sometimes on Thursdays. Someone would say, I see him on Wednesdays. Someone would say, I see him on Tuesdays. I'd say, well, who wants to do his review? Eventually, someone says, I will do it. Well, ultimately, what we know is that often the supervisors aren't really afforded the amount of time that they need. And some of the issues that we see with traditional annual performance reviews are we're really only what we're really doing in an annual review is providing feedback in a one-way street. In other words, we're only telling the employee how we feel about their performance, and very rarely, as we talk about those who are looking at doing a 360, 360s can be tricky, and I will revisit this in a second. But the problem with the annual review is generally is it's one way. We give people 2 or 3 lines at the bottom of the annual performance review to put in a few comments, most of which very few people read and or even more so act on. But one of the things that we know about annual performance reviews are that roughly half of them are completely inaccurate. Right. In other words, there's a failure to adequately grasp and or assess and provide feedback on an employee's performance because of something called often distance bias, right? Or central tendency, rater bias. We're going to talk about all of those in a minute. But distance bias is this tendency to treat things that occurred closer in time and provide them with greater weight than those things that may have occurred, say, 6, 7, 8 months ago. So what we'll often see, and we know this from a lot of the research, is that most annual reviews are based upon the last 6 to 8 weeks of the raters or the managers, supervisors, most recent memory. Great comment that I saw that I thought was annual performance appraisals are that process whereby once a year a company reminds employees who owns them. So one of the things that I used to get when I was an HR director, and even in my prior time in other leadership roles, where I'd have a supervisor walk into a room and say, we got to get rid of Joe, or Joe's got to go, Joe's terrible. And I'd go and say, well, why? It's terrible. He doesn't do this. He doesn't do that. And I'd go to their personnel record, and I'd pull out their personnel file. I'd pull out any area where we might have some of the corrective actions, or even worse off, their annual performance reviews. And what I would tend to find is that in most instances, I'd look at that supervisor and I'd say, Joe's terrible, really. Here you said that he or she meets expectation, or that they're average, right? And there's this tendency we see either of central tendency where everybody's meeting expectations, or in most instances, because managers tend to be very, very uncomfortable with providing feedback, they tend to rate people unnecessarily high. What does that do? Well, if in fact you are a high performing employee and you know that your lower performing employee that's sitting in the seat next to you, comes back from there in a review telling them how wonderfully that they were rated, and you got rated that same way, that tends to be a disincentive for those folks who do work extra hard. Now, there's also something called the idiosyncratic rater effect. And that are those fluctuations that, despite the fact that we all want to be really, really objective, that even within, and the studies have shown that even within very objective frameworks, this idiosyncratic rater effect is this effect where, generally speaking, each person uses their own subjective interpretation of the objective standard. So what we end up with, even at that, is just different folks coming out with the, maybe that somebody used to be a Marine Corps person, and when they're rating uniform, for example, dirty boots are the end of the world, but everything else is squared away, where others are just happy that, frankly, they have boots on at all. And as Rob actually kindly says, a lot of times what happens with that distance effect is that the things that you do tend to remember, right? You place greater weight on the things that happen more frequently, but the things that do break through and get through back further, well, those tend to be the things that are negative generally. So What kind of feedback do we tend to give outside of annual reviews? Well, generally speaking, the only kind of feedback that we tend to, and we hear this all the time, the 80-20 principle, right? That we spend 80% of our time on 20% of the people. And everybody assume, by the way, that the 20% are all terrible folks, or they're the people who are real pain in the butt. And I argue that roughly 15% are the people who are indeed actually a pain in the backside. 5% are really high performers who are in your office every 5 minutes telling you how wonderful they are. Either way, they're burning your precious time, right? So you're spending 80% of your time on 20% of your staff. And what are you doing to the 80% who every day hop in the boat and they're pulling those oars as hard as they can? Every single pull is as hard as they can. Well, what happens with those folks are largely you're completely ignoring them. And generally speaking, because we tend to manage with exception, and I think if you ask your typical your frontline supervisor, what's happening? They're busy, right? When I ask folks, what is it that you have your frontline supervisors doing? Most of the time, what I hear, or if you were to go to your frontline supervisor and say, do me a favor, tell me what it is that you do or what your average every day looks like. What are some of the things that you do when you come in? And one, after they sort of recoil a little bit because they're convinced that what you're going to do is, rate them, actually give them feedback, or that you're going to criticize what they're doing. What you're going to find is that when you look at where your frontline supervisors, according to Gallup, the number one single most important person that drives levels of employee engagement, which we'll tackle in just a minute, is the frontline supervisor. So what do we task those people with doing? Well, literally just about everything. And when I talk to a lot of supervisors in EMS these days, most frontline supervisors are actually out on the road doing ambulance calls rather than doing what they were originally hired to do, which was to provide coaching and mentoring and guidance to those people who were out doing the ambulance calls. So, and research, by the way, when it comes down to it, research, and there's no research in EMS. I'd love to get research on this. But in retail, which is the only research that I could find on this said or suggested that in retail, and that's when everybody's in the same building, in the same box, right? Generally speaking, what we find is that people are spending, the average frontline supervisor spends about 6 to 8% of their time coaching and mentoring employees. So think about that. If they're spending 6 to 8% of their time, when you think about what a supervisor envisions when they apply for that supervisor role, I guarantee you it is coaching and mentoring, the thing that they spend almost the least amount of their time doing. So what do we have them doing outside of that? Well, attending meetings, doing administrative work, sometimes doing ambulance calls, doing frontline work, when in fact, by the way, what the reason they signed up for the job in the first place was that they wanted to coach and mentor people. They thought that they had something to offer. So it's kind of like all of those EMTs or paramedics who we sent through EMT or paramedic program. We taught them a whole bunch of clinical medicine. They took a clinical written exam, then they took a clinical practical exam, and then they applied for a job at our company. We then put them through another clinical written and practical exam. We put them through orientation, where we spend 80% of our time teaching them clinical medicine, and then they get in the ambulance and probably do clinical medicine about 20% of the time. They feel like they got sold a bill of goods, just like your frontline supervisors do. I can remember when I was a frontline supervisor and I would get sent on a call, I knew doing calls was important, but I would argue that that's not the most important thing. You are better off as an ambulance service taking your frontline leader and reassigning them to going out and genuinely connecting and getting to know your field staff, providing them with support and providing them with feedback. And I think ultimately what you would see is a better result. RJ, question: Have you ever seen or heard of companies in California not wanting to do reviews or provide feedback because of potential future litigation? So I've heard of folks saying that they're apprehensive to provide annual performance reviews. And let me talk to you about how that might kick you in the backside. So in the instance where an employee decides, or you terminate an employee, let's say you terminate that employee for performance, and that employee leaves, but of course, the employee doesn't believe that the reason they were terminated was performance. Clearly, it couldn't be because they weren't good at what they did. It had to have been because of some illegal reason, like they terminated you for your religion or your race or your national origin or some other protected, your gender, some other protected category. So that employee who feels that they've been wronged, which by the way, If they feel like we've been wrong, in most instances, it's because we haven't done a good job in the remediation process and through the termination process, that employee doesn't understand exactly why they got let go. But I recognize that sometimes, despite our best efforts, people don't always get the message. So now we talk about employee Joe, who decides, nope, I got terminated because of my religion, walks into your state level or your federal level EEOC, where they would file their discrimination complaint, and says, I got let go from ABC Ambulance because of my race, religion, gender, national origin, whatever it may be. Now, under what's called the burden shifting analysis, the McDonnell Douglas burden shifting analysis, this is where an individual who states a claim upon which relief can be granted, so walks into the EEOC and says, I was let go because of my race, religion, national origin, gender, etc. The burden then shifts from that employee who's now stated their claim over to the employer to articulate a legitimate non-discriminatory reason. So in this instance, let's say we didn't fire Joe because of his race, religion, national origin, gender, etc. We fired Joe because Joe is a terrible, terrible employee, right? We tried to fix Joe, but Joe just was a terrible employee. So now, under the McDonnell Douglas burden shifting analysis, now that I've stated a legitimate non-discriminatory reason as to why that person got let go, the burden shifts back over to the employee. And in this stage of the analysis, all the employee really needs to do is to show that the employer's stated reason is not likely the real reason. So how does one do that? Well, most of you know what we get when we know. One of the things that I often get is, hey, we just got a document request or a personnel record request. What should we do? And I always say, well, of course, you have to furnish it, and usually within a certain period of times in most states, but be prepared for the lawsuit that's going to be coming. So let's say that Joe went out, requested a copy of his personnel record. Well, what are we going to find? In most instances, I used to have someone walk into my office and say, as I said earlier, so-and-so is a terrible employee, we need to let them go. And I would go to their personnel record, and I might find one or two remedial or disciplinary notices. But in most instances, I'd go to their personnel file and I'd find a performance review that listed them as being average, or if not better than average, right? Because of that central tendency or that uncomfortable feeling we get when we have to be honest with people when they're not performing. Most people don't want to do it. They think they're being mean. Well, what happens now? Joe goes into the EEOC and produces that performance review that says I'm meeting expectations or I'm average, right? Average is not a terminable offense, or produces no corrective actions, because I've had people walk in and go, so-and-so is terrible, they stink, they got to go. And I go in their record and there's literally nothing there. So once Joe shows that my stated reason, which is Joe's a terrible employee, is probably not my real reason, because why? I have a performance review that says I'm meeting expectations or there are no disciplinary actions, but certainly not fireable stuff. Well, if I can't overcome that, so how do I overcome that? I say, well, nobody really puts any time into those performance reviews, and our supervisors are busy. They don't have time to provide employees with remediation. You're probably heading down a bad path at this point, right? You're probably not gonna win. So what happens if I can't overcome my lack of documentation that shows Joe's a terrible employee, which supports my stated reason? Well, if in fact I can't overcome that, then the trier of fact is entitled to infer that the real reason is actually the illegal reason. So let's put it this way. Joe says, you let me go because of my religion. I say, no, it's because Joe's a terrible employee. Joe produces a personnel record that says, I'm not a terrible employee, no remedial actions, and a performance review that says I'm average. Well, what is the trier of fact to assume? Well, I'll tell you what they're to assume. They're going to assume that you're probably letting that person go for an illegal reason because you haven't overcome the burden. So this is where traditional performance reviews can bite you in the backside if they're not honest. And so it's important that you understand, great question, RJ, right? That you should be looking at. In fact, if you have an employee who's got multiple disciplinary actions, but has a performance review that looks like they're a model employee, well, then you have a potential litigation issue, or at least an exposure of liability. So the question that I often ask people when they look at this, so I've been researching performance feedback and performance and performance annual performance reviews and effective ways of trying to provide employees with feedback. What are you trying to accomplish with an annual performance review? What are you trying to accomplish? So I'll throw it in the chat for that one. And I hope that we'll have a couple people at least articulate a reason. Why do we do performance reviews at all? Right? As an annual review process. And I don't see, so I'll tell you what I think right off the top, because I'm not seeing anybody pop stuff into the chat. I think for the most part, people are doing them to check a box, right? In fact, actually, if you're an accredited agency through an agency like CAS, the Commission on the Accreditation of Ambulance, you're required to provide people feedback at least once a year on their, based upon their job duties. Now, one of the things that I'll say to folks are at least once a year. Yes, once a year you are required, but in reality, this is a great one. So typically to determine year-end raises, to determine praises, provide QI feedback to give people the raise, or in fact, actually, so let's think about that one thing. People say, well, it's to help determine what raises are going to be. So the next logical question is, how confident are you that your annual performance review process is accurate and reliable and fair? Right? Because if in fact you're going to base your annual raises off of an annual performance review, then you should have a strong faith in the system, in the people performing those, and in the ratings themselves. So providing QI, quality improvement, quality assessment is an important aspect of performance management. However, I argue that if you are only really giving that feedback once a year, that's a problem. I hear sometimes from folks it's to drive results or to drive behavior, but honestly, most of the times what I hear from people are they're not really 100% sure why they're doing it, right? To give people a raise, or that is at least why they believe it. Some people simply expect $1 a raise annually if they meet the requirements or not, and are disappointed if they get less. So that actually raises a really important question, right? If I walk into my review and I'm using a numerical scale, right? And I think in my head that I am I'm a 5 out of 5 on a rating. And you, because you now have, you have a greater span of or a purview of or overlook of all the employees that you're doing, you can look, and let's say you are even pretty accurate at giving me a rating. Let's say that that I sit somewhere around a 4.6, which by the way, on a scale of 1 to 5, 4.6 is outstanding. But if I walk in the door thinking I'm a 5 and you rate me at 4.6, how happy am I going to be? Am I going to walk out of there feeling like, well, hell, 4.6 is really great? No, I'm going to walk out of there, even though I got better than most, I'm going to walk out of there unhappy. So we're required by contract. We must provide them at audit per year. We used to do them to determine raises, but we're separating them entirely. Our process has changed multiple times over the last 67 years, but it has always been annual, and we really just want to encourage growth and goals. So the really just want to encourage growth and goals is the number one reason why you should be providing. But let's talk a little bit. Thank you for that. Because I think truthfully, that's where most people are at, right? What they're looking and wanting to do more, but what we're really looking to do is drive engagement. And so really, what is employee engagement, right? Employee engagement is really that connection between the individual and the work itself, right? It's that mental sort of connection, that mental emotional connection that somebody has with the work that they do, right? And organizations, and Gallup has been researching employee engagement for over 2 decades at this point. And if you've never read State of the American Workplace, I strongly recommend it, or at least read the summary, because what you'll find, and really employee engagement is the goal. Employee satisfaction is nice. However, I've seen plenty of times where we've had employees who look absolutely thrilled at what they do, but they're not actually that good. So what I would say is you're shooting for engagement. And engagement, when an employee is engaged, they give that extra, right? It's that sort of discretionary effort. So what do we see in organizations that have higher levels of engagement, right? Better retention, fewer accidents, 21% higher profitability. Yes, so it was the State of the American Workplace. I got a question. What was that? It's, if you just search Gallup and employee engagement, you're going to find more than you ever wanted to find on this. And another book that I would recommend for folks, if you haven't ever read it, you can watch Daniel Pink on any one of the TED Talks. Daniel Pink, like me, a recovering attorney who talks about drive. And he has actually a couple of TED Talks, but the book Drive is a fantastic, really sort of, it's an expose on performance feedback in general and what intrinsically drives folks. How he has something what he called motivation 2.0, well 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And really what he talks about, and the problem with motivation 2.0, which is where we're motivating people through rewards, or there are tons of studies where they did PET scans with folks where they took a look at rewarding people. And when they rewarded people, what they found in those PET scans are the same areas fired off in their brains that fire off when people get opioids. And so what they found, though, was that rewards become addictive, right? And we've seen this before. I call it prison eating. People wrap their arm around the tray, and if you reach your hand in there, they're going to stab you with a fork. And what I say is, it's today I gave you 50 cents. By next week, they're going to say that was very nice, but I want another 50 cents. And I'm not suggesting that people don't deserve it. I'm not suggesting that the 50 cents was even sufficient. What I'm saying is understand that if you're purely relying on financial reward, you're never going to feed that monster enough. So what you're going to find, folks like me took $1 an hour pay cut. Why? Because the job in the company that I worked for, the people that I worked with, and the patients were what drove me. I figured out a way to make it work. So in the past, what we saw was folks, were looking for what we would see was performance reviews, right? Were generally tied to, what you were going to get in your paycheck. They were primarily driven by what the boss, thought. And very rarely were we asking the employees what they wanted and how we were doing. So where all of the research suggests that this is going now is that, in fact, people want to know what their purpose is. They want to know how you're going to develop them and help them get where they're going, whether it's within your organization or not. They want to know how committed you are to their growth. They want to know, they don't want a once a year, right? Would you tolerate a dog or a spouse that came home once a year? You probably wouldn't. Or a spouse who told you that they loved you once a year? Would you tolerate a dog who came over for hugs once? I would not ever tolerate that, right? They want to know regularly, ongoing, a dialogue. They want a relationship with the organization that they work with. They want to know what their strengths are, and they want to know how you are going to support their life, not just their professional life, their life, right? Supervisors that support more than double the odds of employee engagement. If you haven't read State of the American Workplace, they put it out every single year, Gallup does. What you will find is some mind-blowing statistics in there, right? Organizations that switched to a regular and ongoing performance feedback model, right, found that their employees were 3 times more likely, right, to be engaged than those who received feedback once a year or less. Right. So, and by the way, organizations that did provide regular and ongoing feedback and had higher levels of engagement experienced turnover rates almost 15% lower than those that received little or no feedback. So think about that. If your organization is doing an annual review, and by the way, for those of you who are required to do it because of contract, I get it. You can still do your annual review process and an ongoing mechanism, but just don't let that be your only mechanism for talking and engaging your employees. Recognize that there is a real dollar return on investment on the dollar, really. And I don't have the numbers yet. I'm working on it right now with a couple of different organizations to determine when we see employees more often, when we provide employees more feedback, what do we see in a corresponding return on that investment? I think I'm probably 6 months to a year off of getting any real data. But what I will tell you is I am confident that we will find a relationship between how often our employees are getting engaged and receiving feedback and the bottom line. So one of the things that I'll say about employee, and this will be the last time I beat up the old employee annual performance feedback, is probably feeling a little bit battered at this point. But if you were up there playing or singing your heart out or doing a presentation like this, right? And what you got or what you did, the whole reason you do this, right, is because you're hoping that people will appreciate what you're doing, that you will get accolades in some way, or you will get immediate feedback. This comes back to anybody who's ever been through a psychology 101 class. Pavlov's dog, right? When they rang the bell and then they put the food down, sooner or later, when they rang the bell, the dog started drooling, right? Why? Because there's this classical conditioning that occurs. Now, if when you played your heart out and you did your presentation, and this is one of the reasons why I don't love webinar presentations, and why we try to make them more interactive, or because you guys are on the other side of the screen and we're not getting that feedback that one might get when we were doing this live, right? Doing live presentations is like a form of a really great drug, but doing webinars are a little more challenging because we don't always see whether people are connecting with what we're talking about. But if you did your presentation or you played your heart out on your thing, or Eric, if you're doing your improv and nobody laughs, nobody moves, you get this, right? You are stuck wondering whether what you did mattered, whether you should do more of it, whether you should do less of it, right? Now, I hear from a lot of people that this is the everybody gets a trophy kind of like lifestyle, right? That every person who goes and plays soccer gets a trophy, whether they win or lose. That is not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying is this, that by and large, right, if you in fact engage your employees and talk to them, it doesn't always have to be about saying, hey, you did a great job. But it sure is about when you walk up to your employee, don't get caught going like, Eric, how you doing? And they're like, you read my name tag, right? You need to know who your folks are. And the only way that happens is by building relationships with your staff, right? I mean, keep in mind that most people spend more time in the workplace than they do with their family. And in EMS, that's probably even worse. In fact, I shot a video related to gender harassment or gender-related issues in EMS. And one of the things that one of the guys in the video said is, I spend more time with my partner than I do with my wife. And he said, of course, we're going to have a different kind of relationship. Well, what I would suggest to you is that when all of the time when I ask leaders, what are your supervisors doing day to day? They have literally really no idea. They're managing the shift. They're trying to make sure that schedules are filled or deliver supplies, or maybe they're doing scene command on large scale events. But when I say, how often are your people engaging, your supervisors engaging your staff? What kind of relationship do they have with the staff? Many times I'll get blank stares. Remember that this is a relationship business. An employment relationship is just like a friendship. It's just like a marriage. It is a 50-50 relationship, right? Your employees did not win the lottery when you gave them that job. No more so than you won the lottery when they accepted it. And what I will say to you is you have to put the work in if you want to see the result. What we know, generally speaking, is when you put the time in, you will build trust, right? Only 42% of employees trust their boss. Can you do those? Yeah. So 42% of employees trust their boss. 58% trust complete strangers. Think about that, right? How many times have you talked with your staff where they sort of get the impression that you're keeping something from them? And I always want to say there isn't a secret sauce, right? It's just, what is it, mayonnaise and ketchup mixed together? That's a secret sauce. There really isn't anything. Here's the thing. The reason that they think that you're keeping something from them is because they don't have a relationship with you, right? And when there's that lack of trust, well, guess what? Regular check-ins, regular feedback builds trust between individuals. So years ago, Deloitte Consulting, there's an article, Harvard Business Review. And if you search this, Harvard Business Review, reinventing performance feedback, type in Harvard Business Review, Deloitte, you'll find this article. Deloitte Consulting, largest consulting firm in the world, right, had an annual performance feedback process that they argued was costing them $5.5 billion per year. $5.5 billion per year. They were worried about it being objective. So every year they got a crew of people together, and that crew of people talked about what objective criteria should we try and measure? How do we measure it? And then let's put together a form and let's send people out to do it. Well, in Deloitte, most of their consulting folks work in teams of 6 to 8 people. And so what they thought was, they noticed that they were still not getting good business results. They still had relatively high turnover, and they decided to do something revolutionary. They got away from an annual performance review and went to what was a 4-question subjective review that every team leader filled out on their team. So at Deloitte, their teams work in teams of 6 to 8 with a team leader. And at the end of every project, the consulting projects lasted typically 1 to 2 weeks, generally not more than a month. The team leader would fill out 4 questions on each member of their team. Did they do good work? Do you want to work with them again? Are they progressing in their role? And if it were up to you, would you move them forward or would you promote them up? And what they found after a year, and I think they're now in year 5, they've made some modifications to it, were that every single performance metric changed for the better. Every single one. So they worried so much. Everyone always worries so much about being objective. Well, I've already told you that objective criteria by and large doesn't really matter because you're still probably pretty subjective. And if any of you have worked on ambulances, did you really care what your boss thought about you versus what your partner thought about you? And why did partners grow such a strong relationship? Well, they grow an incredibly strong relationship because after every call, I look at RJ and say, RJ, what do you think? Did that go all right? That was kind of a crazy call. Did this go all right? Did that go? If RJ looked at me and said, you did a great job, I don't necessarily have to even talk about what specifically did I do all that well because it happened close enough in time with the performance that more than likely I'm going to go do more of that or do less of that, right? It's about building trust. So looking at, consider using feedback as a way to empower your team, not to be punitive. The bottom line is this, that generally speaking, what they found is that when you provide performance feedback to people, by and large, you only see about a 10% change in performance. So if somebody was really good at something, really good at something, you're going to make them a little bit better rather than someone who's not so good at something. You're only going to make them less not so good. So you need to establish an environment or a culture where we're all accountable to each other. Because I've got news for you. It actually matters more what your employees think of you than what you think of them. And in reality, when I talk to folks about making sure that they get feedback from their employees, they say, you want me to solicit feedback from my employees? I go, well, you're getting it now. You just probably aren't hearing it. So let's get to sort of what are the things that you need to do, right? Your performance feedback should be based on outcomes. But when I say outcomes, what I talk about are, 1, ask your employees, if we were going to give you regular and ongoing feedback, or we were going to be measuring things for you, what would you want to hear from us about? What is it that you would like for us to give you feedback? Because how much more compelling is it when someone says, I'm giving you feedback based upon what you told me you wanted to hear? That's part of the building the relationship piece, right? You need to do positive reinforcement. It has been shown time and time and time again that positive reinforcement is actually more effective than a negative reinforcement. Needs to be given frequently, like so frequently that actually it becomes sort of a standard thing. Not everybody gets a prize. And no, not, hey, thanks so much for wearing your uniform today. But building a relationship by which that when you do actually give someone some sort of feedback, whether it be positive or negative, actually it isn't really an assault or something that's so unusual for them. It needs to be personalized, and it does need to be private for the most part. If you're praising as we talk, you can do that in public, right? But if you are in fact having to give some constructive feedback, right? Constructive criticism, I always say, is welcome. Constructive criticism is criticism that's built to try and improve me. If it's just criticism, then that's not welcome. So timely and specific, right? Don't ring the bell and put the food down a year later. Don't have someone do something great and then tell them 6 months later that they did a great job, right? It's great if you in fact do that, but you should tell them something right away. And it needs to be the right time, the right context. So by and large, people go, well, this is really complicated. We need to make sure that we're being really, really descriptive. Often what we found is that it's tell them to do more of it, to do less of it, or to do exactly as they're doing. It doesn't need to be overwhelmingly complicated. Negative and constructive feedback are not the same thing, right? Constructive feedback is feedback that's intended to help someone improve. Negative feedback is really just plain old criticism. It's not simply telling someone, have you considered doing X? You're simply saying you're not doing X, or you're not doing X well. The way to really deliver constructive criticism is to say, have you thought about trying it this way? Or have you thought about how, this might be more effective, right? Negative feedback immediately causes people to back up, right? That's just natural. You're paddling against the stream if you think that you're not going to get there. One of the things that I see people do often is the love sandwich, right? This is where we walk in and we say, hey, RJ, great job on such and such, but hey, I just want to talk to you about being late this morning. You really shouldn't be late. If it happens again, in fact, I'm going to have to write you up. But hey, thanks for all the hard work that you're doing, right? All that is, if you have siblings, right, and you're used to, like my family, when someone walks into the house and all of us are sitting there, people move up because we're waiting to get a little cuff off the back of the head. The problem with the love sandwich is any good feedback, whether it's legitimate or not, is never going to be truly accepted. In fact, not even really heard. Why? Because they're always waiting for the but, right? And most times I find that when people are trying to do the love sandwich is more about you than it is about them. You're uncomfortable being direct. You're uncomfortable being honest. And what I've found in all the years when I've not been well, and in fact, we all know it, right? If you've ever done a presentation, you get back 50 reviews that all say, hey, the feedback, the surveys were great, but there was one that said you stunk. That's the one that like cuts you right to the bone, right? So just remember, the love sandwich does not work. This is something that, folks, when I ask people, have you gone through and provided training to your employees on how to both give and how to both receive? We can't possibly tackle all that here. I do have courses that we do, and we've done them at annual conferences, and we've done them, independently at different training sessions where we talk about not only giving feedback, but then also how to receive feedback, right? A lot of times when we turn someone into a supervisor, we hand them a set of keys and the 1-minute manager, and we say, if anything catches on fire, make sure you call us, kid, right? That's usually about the extent of the training. And even in many of the training programs, unless you've been through something like ASM or the Leadership Academy, a lot of times they don't really talk about ways to communicate with people and what's effective, right? Don't ever be giving feedback with a cell phone in your hand. Don't sit down and put your cell phone on the table. The research says that once every 6 to 8 seconds, the person's going to look at your phone on the table. You're literally putting something between you and the other individual. Don't do that. You need to be training your managers on what's the proper technique, how to approach folks. What should the conditions be? Where should you be in the room, right? What should be in between you? How many times have you walked in and said, boss, I got to talk to you about something. The boss is like typing away and then looks up and goes like, I'm listening. That's not an effective mechanism, right? You need to be active listening, making sure that you're telling that person back. I cannot tell you how many times I have teenagers. I know darn right well they're not listening to me. And then I get frustrated when they actually weren't listening to me. Ask questions. The best way to get an employee to accept constructive criticism or feedback, positive or negative, is to start the entire conversation with, how are we doing, right? I had a boss in the Boston area, one of the best bosses I ever worked with, almost always kind of said, what can I do to help you? It made me actually always want to work harder. That's one of the best and most effective ways to get employees to be able to listen and trust you, is to say, what can we be doing better? How could we be doing it better? What could I better do to support you? Positive reinforcement actually means more when you've said, please tell me what we could be doing better. By the way, if your employees actually say nothing, and don't wait for nothing, push them a little further. So there really isn't anything we can do better. Truthfully, you want to get past the initial niceties. I very distinctly remember when I was the CEO at an ambulance service, I used to walk through the cruise area because I thought I was being very employee centric. And while walking through one day, I said, hey, how's everybody doing? What's going on? And as I kept cruising along, one of the employees said, well, if you're not going to stick around for the answer, would you ask the question for? Now, probably not the way I would have typed, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. And I realized that I wasn't actually listening. So important, the only way, right? And this is, if you measure no other key performance indicator, measure how often your frontline leaders are interacting with your frontline staff. Everything else will fall in line if you're regularly interacting with your frontline staff, right? The only way you can get to know your staff is by walking around, right? You shouldn't have to look at their name tag. We know for a fact, right, that supervisors account for at least 70% of the variance in levels of employee engagement across business units, right? The relationship with their immediate supervisor is the number one thing that impacts employee engagement. Company culture cannot be cheated, right? Speaks louder than any mission statement on your wall. Most times when I ask owners their mission statement, they can't usually get through it. Your mission statement, right, should be, yes, you should be standing for great patient care. But if you're an ambulance organization saying we're going to give great patient care, awesome. That's wonderful, because if your mission statement said we're going to try and underachieve today when it comes to patient care like we've never underachieved before. But what's your mission statement? What's your employee value proposition? That's the statement or the thing that you say to your employees about what they're going to get if they commit their life to you, or at least part of their life, right? Workforce, company culture is an important workplace differentiator, right? Look on Glassdoor. If you've never looked on Glassdoor, search your company. Again, I go back to Royal. I have to give them credit. Glassdoor wins. They have an award in which only employees vote you. It's not like those awards where you have to pay to get told that you're a place to work, right? Look on Glassdoor. That's where you're going to know what you are as an employer, right? 27% of employees strongly believe in their own company or their company values. Open door policies, and I know we're getting near the end here. I often hear companies say we have an open door policy, which I think it's cute, except for just remember that the open door policy is so that you get up and leave your office. Because if you're expecting people to come into your office in order to engage you, you are sending a message. Yeah, I'll be here if you come. Just remember, really great leaders are rarely in their office, right? If you have frontline supervisors who are sitting in an office most of the day, you've got a problem, right? You need your folks. The open door is supposed to remind you that you can walk out of it. All right. How often are your frontline leaders, if those are the people who drive employee engagement and ultimately business results more than any other single factor, including pay, including other work conditions, if those are that's the number one driver, should you not be measuring that? Don't guess and estimate. How many times do employees come in and go, this happens all the time? And I go, well, when's the last time it happened? They go, well, yesterday. I go, when's the time before that? And I go, a month ago. I go, when's... I'm like, if you can't remember, then it probably doesn't happen all the time, right? Give your supervisors time. Do not just load this on top of the Beverly Hillbilly wagon where even grandma's at the very, very top. You need to carve out time in which your folks are provided to go out and interact with people. In fact, you should be asking them, how many folks did you see today? How many interactions? What's going on? Provide them with a mechanism for that, right? It will pay dividends on every level. One of the last, and we're on the last couple of slides here, and I appreciate everyone's, I appreciate all the comments that we have gotten, and I know we still have a fair chunk of folks on here. He, she, or they who bring a story are taking one away. If someone walks into your office and says, hey, did you hear about so-and-so, right? Just recognize that that person is walking into the next office and the next office and the next office and telling that exact same story. If they say, did you hear about so-and-so, and it's because they're genuinely concerned for one of their coworkers, listen to them, talk to them. If they come in and start talking smack, stop them in their tracks and tell them that kind of behavior is not welcome. That's the kind of stuff that will undermine every single thing that your organization does. Do not tolerate it, not amongst team members, not in between coworkers. Do not tolerate it. So, solicit feedback. Most effective ways to get employee to accept feedback is to solicit it. Provide an environment that's safe. When people tell you something that you don't want to hear, don't recoil. Don't act all kinds of wonky and get funky and run out of the room, right? Tell someone thank you for providing that feedback. Truthfully, tell them thank you for feeling comfortable enough, right? If they're telling you things that are not very complimentary, it's more than likely because they feel comfortable. You've set an environment in which they feel comfortable to do that. Anonymous feedback mechanisms. Most people go, we don't accept anonymous feedback. And I go, well, you really should, honestly, because not everybody does feel comfortable, by the way. And frankly, if you've built a great relationship with your staff, remember that you won't get anonymous feedback. Why? Because your people will know that feedback is something that everyone is accountable to each other, right? Don't be defensive. Own your mistakes. Read between the lines, right? Get past the niceties of how you all doing today and only to get stopped in your tracks when they go, you're not even listening to the answer, right? And then act on feedback. Question: have you had any feedback from companies that are forced to give raises because the state local government requires higher wages, i.e., City of Los Angeles limiting company giving raises, having the same because of a new rule? This happens during their review. How do you approach something like this? Attempt to bring. So let me be clear. First of all, California is kind of the wild, wild west. No pun intended. Whenever I want to know what's going to come across the United States, California, then New York, or Massachusetts, or California, New York, then Massachusetts. So just because you're forced to do an annual review, and you may even be forced to do raises during the annual review, do not let that dissuade you from giving regular and ongoing feedback, right? It is about building a relationship with your coworkers. It's a great question, RJ. That is not a limiter for you on providing feedback. Your frontline supervisors, I am 100% convinced that if we divested supervisors of almost everything else that they do and said, go out and act like the personal trainers or the support mechanism for the people out in the street, that we would see a significant change in the way that organizations in profitability and turnover, et cetera, right? Remember, in employment, generally, when performance stinks, we end up getting rid of the employee. But in sports, when team performance stinks, it's usually the coach. So one of the things that I wanted to say, and I thank my good friend from California for reminding me that 8 years ago today was the Boston bombing. In fact, the last time I put on a private ambulance uniform, because we ran out of ambulances, we were running around trying to find amputation kits. Folks were truly gravely in danger. And it was the first time, as I said, the last time I put on a private ambulance service, but it was the first time I ever thought, I don't want to get to a call, because I heard them say, if you're in the staging area, you need to evacuate. And if you can't get your ambulance out of there, you need to run. It was the first time I remember feeling frightened, like on that kind of level. And so just today, a moment of silence for those people who did lose their lives on that day, for all of those first responders, not only on the Boston bombing day, but then also over this last year with COVID. I cannot thank them for their sacrifice, as well as their families who have gone without them every single day, not only while they were alive because of holidays and work, but today because they're no longer with us. So I can't thank them enough for that. I can't thank their families enough for that. That being said, I know we're at the top of the hour. We're actually, I think, even a few minutes over. I want to thank you for attending today. I know that you have a lot of stuff that call for your time. Certainly, I have plenty of training and educational programs around how to provide feedback, how to give feedback, how to accept feedback, and how teams should be designed so that they actually have a culture of accountability. If you have any questions, certainly you can always email through the info@ambulance.org. You can certainly, my contact information is up there on the screen, but I thank you all very, very much for attending and for your active involvement. And I wish you a great afternoon. As I said, we'll send out the recording tomorrow, and a copy of the slides will be in the Daily Digest. So with that, I thank you. I think we answered all of our questions. So I hope you have a great day. Thanks.